It says, I have a question regarding the body's insulin response. I have heard you mention how it is anabolic and important when building muscle, but I have also heard that it is what causes you to store fat. I am just confused hearing the opposing sides and feel like it is so important to understand because I have clients avoiding carbs thinking it is an insulin response that is causing them to gain weight.
Really good question. The insulin thing is really confusing for a lot of people because there was this, I want to say they call it the insulin obesity hypothesis. And basically what this is that these gurus, quote unquote, believe that insulin is the reason for obesity. People have poor insulin sensitivity. They have dysfunctional insulin levels, and that causes obesity because insulin is a storage hormone, right? It is a hormone that's going to store energy. When you tap out your energy stores, where do you store, quote unquote, energy, which is calories, which is food?
Yeah.
Body fat, right? So, yes, insulin can be the transporter for storing body fat, but it can also be the transporter for storing muscle glycogen to perform better and build muscle, which is why it's an anabolic hormone. It's one of those things too where you will not, so this is the way I always try to break it down to clients. So this is perfect for you to explain to your clients because clients are more gen pop and you want to be able to break this down easily. You will not, like, insulin's not going to do anything negative for you, and it's not going to cause body fat storage until you get to a point where you will have too much energy coming in for you to maintain and or lose weight, which is another way of saying you're in a calorie surplus.
Totally.
Right? If you eat too much food, you're going to store fat, right? That's to nobody's surprise. Insulin is the thing that helps you store those calories as fat. So it's not insulin that's the issue here. It's that you're eating too much damn food. So if you're eating at maintenance, and to an extent, depending on who you are, a slight surplus if you're trying to gain weight or build muscle. But if you're in a deficit or you're in at maintenance, insulin is your friend because you're not eating in a surplus. It's not going to cause you to store body fat. It's going to help facilitate the transport of nutrients to the muscle to perform better. It's also going to blunt cortisol. We've talked about this a bunch on the podcast. Insulin and cortisol have an inverse relationship, which basically means when we spike insulin, cortisol drops, right? Cortisol being elevated is a stress hormone. So when we train, when we have stress at work, when we're overwhelmed, when we're anxious, when we're scared, we're anything like that, when we get lack of sleep, anxiety goes up, stress goes up, so on and so forth. But it's all because cortisol is going up. Cortisol is the hormone that literally causes stress. It's a stress hormone. When we train really hard and our adrenaline goes up, same thing. Cortisol goes along with it, which is actually not a bad thing. Like, we need cortisol to wake us up in the morning. When you woke up this morning, cortisol spike, that cortisol curve is what they call it in the morning, that actually gets you out of bed. It gets you moving and producing in your day. Adrenaline is good too, both of which are going to spike during training. When cortisol goes up and adrenaline goes up during training, I'm able to push really hard because cortisol and adrenaline are a fuel source, right? It's something that drives higher intensities and stimulates my nervous system to push harder and harder. So to some people, that's not a bad thing. And there was even like Olympic weightlifting coaches back in the day that would like really push against having too many carbs pre or intra workout, right? Whereas a bodybuilder will have a bunch of carbs before and sometimes carbs sipped out throughout the workout. Because if we do that, we're fueling the muscle, obviously, but also we're continually managing that cortisol response. And cortisol is a catabolic hormone. Catabolic means break down. Anabolic means build up.
Yeah.
So if we blunt that cortisol response during training, we might actually build more muscle. But an Olympic weightlifter isn't there to build muscle. He's there to be explosive. He needs his nervous system amped up and fired up, which means adrenaline and cortisol might actually benefit that athlete. So we don't want too many carbs in the session. So because, going back to the point, there's this inverse relationship. And when cortisol's high, a good way to bring it back down is to spike insulin up because they have an inverse relationship. So saying that insulin is bad is completely false. And I've gotten so many people who come to me that have cut carbs out, and it causes them to, one, be in a deficit, which we know negatively impacts the thyroid and increases your cortisol levels, right? So they're in a deficit, so cortisol's a little bit higher. They're getting no carbs, so cortisol's even higher because they don't have any carbs to help blunt that cortisol response that's elevated from dieting. And then they're stressed out because they're in a deficit. They can't eat the food they love. They're trying to restrict carbs and treats and things like that. So all these things lead to more stress, more cortisol, and it's this chronic elevation of cortisol that leads to poor results, high stress, anxiety, so on and so forth. If I get that person and I go, hey, we're going to bring your fats down, we're going to actually increase calories just slightly, but we're going to mainly do it via carbs, all of a sudden they drop weight immediately, which is usually water, right? They drop a bunch of water weight, which cortisol is a stress hormone that actually retains water. So if cortisol is super high and you're super stressed, you're going to be retaining water. So you're going to look watery and you think you're gaining bad weight. It's just water from stress. But when we spike insulin with those carbohydrates, cortisol drops, water flushes out, and then you're in a less stressed place. Your hormones are going to be a little bit better off and you're probably going to start losing weight now. And that's where insulin actually worked in somebody's advantage to lose more body fat. So I think at the end of the day, the best way to explain it to clients is unless you are in a calorie surplus, insulin is not going to cause any negative effects. It's actually a really important hormone for performance, for stress management, for building muscle. And again, it's a storage hormone. Body fat isn't the only thing you store in your body. Your body, it's a storage hormone, but it's also like an energy facilitator. So if you want energy for training, for movement, for everything in your day-to-day life, you need insulin. Insulin's one of the biggest affecting, I guess you would call it. It's one of the hormones that affects the vast majority of hormones more than any other hormone. Thyroid's kind of like the control center. It's controlling a lot of things, but insulin specifically affects all the other hormones in big ways. It even facilitates better amino acid uptake into the bloodstream. So a lot of people don't know this, but when you spike insulin, you might actually have better transport of amino acids. If you have better transport of amino acids, guess what? You have better muscle protein breakdown and balance ratio.
Totally.
Muscle protein synthesis breakdown ratio, which is going to lead to more muscle growth, better recovery, performance, so on and so forth. So there's a ton. I mean, there's so many reasons why I think insulin is demonized for the wrong reasons. Like there's so many bad reasons it's demonized, and it's all because of this obesity insulin hypothesis or epidemic, they call it. And it's just not true. I mean, a good example of this too is there was the rice diet experiment, it wasn't technically a research study, but it was conducted by a doctor, and they had at least 10, but they had a good amount of people, men and women, all were extremely obese, and they put them on this rice diet, right? Every single day they ate purely white rice and either a piece of fruit or a fruit puree just for the vitamins and minerals in it. But point being, no protein, no fat. Literally rice and a little bit of fruit all day, every day, just carbs.
Weird.
They lost, on average, I want to say it was 126 pounds during the experiment.
For how long was the duration?
I can't remember off the top of my head. It wasn't extensively long, though. Like,
Yeah.
it was a pretty... Now, they were in a deficit. They were in a calorie deficit for sure, but their calorie deficit...
Like 6 months? A year?
Maybe. No, not a year.
126 points.
It was a lot, man.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog about, I want to say metabolic No, it was in the carb cycling blog. So you can check out the carb cycling blog. We'll link that in the show notes of this podcast. We'll also link, we have a blog called Hormone Crash Course or something like that, written by Lisa. And it goes over all the hormones, testosterone, thyroid, cortisol, everything. But you can learn about insulin in that article as well. And then in that carb cycling one, I talk about this experiment. But it was less than a year for sure. It was a significant transformation. And granted, these are obese, very obese individuals. They have on average 127 pounds to lose, 126 pounds. You got to be pretty heavy to be able to lose that amount of weight in any given amount of time. And they were specifically fed a calorie deficit, but all their calories comprised of carbohydrates, and they lost on average 126 pounds, which just goes to show that these individuals had their insulin spiked constantly throughout the duration of the study, and they still lost a ton of weight, because one of the predominant things that leads to insulin sensitivity is not your diet, but it's your activity in the gym, and it's how lean you are. So you can look at the insulin sensitivity of a NFL lineman, right? They might have better insulin sensitivity than a regular person that is of their weight, because they're active, right? But they're going to have poorer insulin sensitivity to somebody who is the same height but leaner, because body fat storage on your body determines insulin sensitivity to an extent. But I think point being, is it Kaylee that asked the question? Kaylee?
Yep.
The best way to describe this to your clients is, if you're not in a calorie surplus, there's no reason for you to fear insulin. It's not a problem. I personally have carbs in every single meal, and I try to keep that as long as I can during a diet because it helps manage stress and energy levels throughout the day. Plain and simple. So especially if you have stressed individuals, sometimes going higher carb actually works better. And I think this is honestly one of the things that like makes, and maybe this is just my thought process, but makes our coaching kind of appealing because a lot of us on the team use high carb diets with clients.
Yeah.
And it goes against what most people think you're supposed to do, yet we keep getting great results with people and it's easy for them to sustain. It's because we're not eliminating carbs.
Yeah.
You know, for some people it's balanced where it's like moderate carb, moderate fat. For other people it's really high carb, low fat. For some people it is high fat, low carb. But I would say the vast majority is in the moderate or the high carb camp, and they're doing great.
Yeah.
They love it, you know? So
Totally.
yeah.
Love it, man. All right. Next question comes from Austin Bagshow.
Real quick.
What up?
I got to add this too, Kaylee. You should probably talk to your clients about de novo lipogenesis, which is the process of turning a carbohydrate into a glucose and then into lipid, which is fat in the body. So we've talked about this before on the podcast. Like eating fat, it's easy for your body to convert that into stored fat because it already is a lipid as a molecule. So it's a little bit easier. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot. So when you get closer to that surplus range, your body's more likely to store the fat versus the carb.
Yeah.
If you're in a surplus, you have to be in a surplus for this to happen regardless. But talk to them about this is helpful too, because you can tell them like, hey, your body doesn't want to store carbs as fat. Actually, it actually wants to use it for your brain and for training performance. So having carbs in your diet is not a bad thing. It's your body's preferred fuel source. And de novo lipogenesis is this process of turning carbohydrates into a fat, which only happens if you're overeating overall calories completely, and it's not a favorable process for your body to make, right? It's the same thing with gluconeogenesis, which is the process of taking proteins and turning them into glucose, carbohydrates, for fuel. It's not a very efficient process for your body to take proteins and make them into fuel because it wants that protein for other rebuilding processes in the body. So when someone goes on a super low carb diet and they start having to pull from protein in order to have energy to do their day-to-day functions or training, now we have less protein to be able to rebuild and recover our muscle tissue, which is not what we want.
Totally.
Right. So just another thing to maybe add to your clients.
Yeah.